Fantastic. So I think we are about to start because I see enough people in the room, and I'm sure more people will come as we start. So yeah, thank you for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. And thank you so much again for being here. I'm Juan Fernández Ochoa. I'm Campaigns and Communications Officer at IDPC, the International Drug Policy Consortium, which is a network of 190 organizations of civil society and community-led networks who come together to promote drug policies that advance social justice and human rights. If you didn't know, you have joined in defense of decriminalization, a baseline upon which to build sustainable drug policy, an event that IDPC is delighted to co-organize with all of the organizations that we're gonna drop in the chat. As you can see from the number of organizations that we're mentioning in the chat and are represented in the panel, this is a topic that is very close to our hearts and our organizations. I'm really, really glad to be sharing this panel with fantastic activists, harm reductionists, advocates. We have with us André Belchior Gomes from Release and TalkingDrugs in the United Kingdom, Isabel Pereira from Dejusticia in Colombia, Theshia Naidoo from the Drug Policy Alliance in the United States, Joana Canêdo from the European Network of People Who Use Drugs and also the Manage project in GATT in Portugal, and Angela McBride from the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs, SAMPUD in South Africa, of course. I won't be reading everyone's bios at the moment, but we'll drop them in the chat as the conversation moves forward. This event today launches the latest updates to the drug decriminalization across the world map, which André will introduce shortly, and provides space for colleagues to share experiences and insights on decriminalization. What is working, what is not working as well, and what needs to be improved, and how do we improve it? It comes at a time where decriminalization is under attack in different corners of the world. And in this sense, this is an event to remind each other of why undermining the apparatus of punishment established by prohibition is important, and what kind of world we expect to usher in through the abolition of this apparatus of punishment. Before I pass the floor to my colleagues, I just wanted to share a few thoughts on the topic. The first one is mostly an intention for this conversation to be grounded in material reality. Yes, there's a legal aspect to the idea of decriminalization as much as it alludes to removing criminal penalties, and that usually entails, of course, legal reform, which is very important. But this is not a conversation about the law per se. This is a conversation about people, about dramatic disparities in wealth and power in our societies, which push so many into harm, pain, and premature death, and the role that drug decriminalization has played in fueling these injustices. It is also worth highlighting that many of us in drug policy and in harm reduction mobilize and organize for change precisely because we have experienced firsthand the violence and neglect that comes with being associated with drugs or being profiled as being associated with drugs directly and indirectly. We've been denied care, we've seen our people brutalized by the violence of the war on drugs, we've witnessed our neighbors and loved ones be hurt or pushed into premature death because of an unsafe, unstable supply of drugs. And so for most of us, decriminalization is not an abstract concept, but a concrete and practical tool to diminish the pain that we know that the war on drugs causes to people like us and people that we love. And so the kind of decriminalization that we envisage for ourselves and for each other is not a reformist tweak of the legal system. We're not interested in tinkering with the peripheries of the state's apparatus of violence and control. We're interested in collective liberation. And so we deserve more than superficial reforms. We want to address the root causes of harm that we see in our communities. And in doing so, we have to focus on the violence of drug policing and criminalization, which lie at the heart of the war on drugs. We cannot respond to the needs of our communities with violence and neglect and expect transformation and healing. Criminalization and its punitive logic can only perpetuate the suffering that we witness in our lives and in our communities. Now, I'm talking about dismantling this edifice of punishment, but decriminalization has a mirror image in creation. In parallel to diminishing the power that enables so many institutions to harm us, we must lay the foundations for a better and sustainable future for each other. That can only be a collective endeavor. The idea that we hear very often in activist spaces, and which is very important, leaving no one behind, is not simply an empty call or a slogan, but a real invitation to ensure that everyone has access to what they need: food, housing, healing, joy, etc. To put it simply, we need to care for each other and reject the disposability that prohibition and criminalization currently invite us to offer to each other. And I'm not just talking about public health care, which is of course needed, but also community-led forms of care that should be the backbone of the response. Basically, what I just described is the IDPC network gold standard for decriminalization, which calls for a removal of all sanctions for drug use and related activities, for all substances, of course, the promotion of voluntary access to systems of care and support, a model of decrim that is developed with and by people who use drugs, and people who use drugs continue to be involved in it, or they should continue to be involved in it, in its implementation and review, where authorities adhere to the model. And so we talk about the importance of training and compliance, because very often we have models of decriminalization that are in the law or in paper. On paper, they look positive, but then the implementation is a completely different story. And where resources are redirected away from the punitive apparatus on the state and towards rights-affirming services and systems of care, as I just said. That model that I just alluded to, the gold standard of decriminalization, is unfortunately not fulfilled anywhere in the world, but there's definitely aspects of ongoing decrim models that gesture towards it. And also there's the opposite. In the map, you will discover that some forms of decriminalization are highly, highly flawed, and André will imminently present this tool and this map that we're very happy to be launching the updates for today. So André, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. Can you guys hear me? Perfect, amazing. Thank you so much. I was gonna complain that I was tired and then realized there's people logging on from Southern California and Oregon, and so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, so my name is André. I'm the editor of Talking Drugs. I've been editing the platform that Talking Drugs is, a global news platform for people that use drugs and all things drugs, for a couple of years now. And one of the big projects that we have here is running the decrim map that Juan has been speaking about. This has been put together and developed by Release and IDPC for a long time now, and now we're very happy to have DPA also supporting with some of the US updates that have been put on it. But it essentially grew as a way of us understanding what is going on with global decriminalization, to also prove that this isn't something that's new or innovative. It's actually a very tried and tested solution for controlling drugs from across the world. The latest update, and I was just checking this before coming on the call, there are 34 countries that have tried some form of decriminalization, and this includes 26 jurisdictions around the world. Now, as Juan also said, this can also be done incredibly well, or it can be done in really problematic ways. And I think this is also some of the problems that we have around decriminalization. There's a lot of approaches that you can come with it, and it can also be quite a frustrating force that removes a lot of momentum from our movement, because you can get decriminalization across the line, but that won't necessarily mean that change on the ground for people that use drugs has really happened, you know, and we can't lose steam from this moment. So I wanted to first share with you guys Talking Drugs as a platform. Just gonna quickly share my screen. So this is here, the website for Talking Drugs, and this is where you're gonna be able to find a lot of stories around drug news and drug policy from the world. But going into the resources section, you will find the interactive map for drug decriminalization around the world. Here on the link, you'll then be able to open up the map, and here it is in all of its glory. Now, yeah, there was a lot of custom coding that went into it, honestly, and this means that you can go into each jurisdiction, into each country, to understand how the systems have been put there. There's always going to be some shocking examples there, and I think my favorite one is the Russian Federation, which you can just select. It will bring you down to the actual countries. And then it will just give you a bit of information on how it works. You know, we've got all these different categories on how its implementation works, when its decriminalization was put together, what the legal framework documents are in case you want to do that internal research, and some of the thresholds. Where we managed to find them as a table format, we have all this information here. The reason why I say Russia is an interesting case is because even though they have decriminalized drugs in 2004 and actually had added in the thresholds category, I think in 2008, it's still one of the most violent and repressive models of decriminalization, showing that even though on paper this can still happen, how it is actually put into practice can be really different. And then we also try to add in some extra information, you know, from latest updates that we get from the movement. The references that we've collected are usually here at the bottom. Because decriminalization is also just a legal model, this is always on the change and always requires some updates. This is something that we're working with advocates from all over the world. Usually we try to get in touch with members of this specific country to at least validate what the reality is like on the ground, add in some details from people that use drugs to just understand whether this system that we see here on the legal background, if it actually is the case in practice. So just going back up to the beginning of the map, I wanted to draw your attention to something else, that we actually have the ability to translate the map as well into several languages. Currently, we have our entire website in 7 different languages and able to translate immediately into them when we just change them, but I'm just going to keep it in English for now. As I change it into another language. Oh, God. There we go. So another good characteristic with it is that we can break it down into different activities. So if we want to look at, for example, the cultivation of cannabis, we can apply that filter and then narrow down the countries that actually have any sort of explicit legislation on this that has been put together. And then we can actually go down into these countries to drill down in this information. By removing the filter, you get the whole map again. And another useful feature as well is just breaking it down into the states. So this is particularly useful for countries like the US, Australia, Canada that are broken down into a federal system. And then we can actually drill down into each state's perspective, getting all the information that we have down there, from Alaska all the way to Hawaii and more. So that is kind of the map at this moment. We also have some filters around year ranges also to show that it isn't something that's new. It has been put into practice for a long time. I believe that the Netherlands may be the oldest model that we have. But yeah, just a good way to continue showing that the map is constantly evolving. We do have meetings with IDPC to reflect on the changes that it needs. But again, we're always on the lookout to work with some organizations on the ground to validate these findings. So if you are interested in getting involved, if you are interested in providing us some information of what exactly decriminalization looks like on the ground, or if you do know of any bills that have been put into place within the region or specific countries, please share with us. And yeah, super happy to take any questions or explain how the map works as well.
Thank you so much for that presentation, André. And everyone will have the possibility of asking questions at the end of presentations. There's also a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and you're very welcome to start dropping questions there. We will do our best to answer them later. To pick up on something that you said towards the end, André, in terms of decriminalization not being sort of like a new experiment or sort of a new occurrence, there's actually many decriminalization models that have been in place since the 70s. In the case of Uruguay, actually, the country never criminalize drug possession. So this is by no means new, and that's why we decided to start this presentation with, I mean, notwithstanding that, you know, Oregon model, Portuguese model, incredibly fascinating, and we'll hear from that in a second. We wanted to start with a model that actually has been in place since 1994, and the sky hasn't fallen over, I guess. Isabel, please tell us a little bit about the situation in Colombia with decrim, which has already such a long standing practice.
Hello, good morning to everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, IDPC, for putting this space together. So I want to just go over specifically on the story of Colombia's decree model, which in Latin America, besides the Uruguayan experience, is quite it was quite historic, and it was quite early on in the game. So I will share a very small slide just on. We know it's not about the legal stuff, but it is about the legal stuff as well. So I just want to point out the fact that back in 1920, there was one of the first law that declared that the sale and import of drugs that quote unquote form pernicious habits was under prohibition. So we had a prohibition model even before there were the international treaties. This law is still existent today, still valid today. It is the law that creates our National Narcotics Board. So it's where it all stems from. And again, it was before the conventions even existed. But then once the implementation of the international regimes rolled out, we got the National Narcotics Statute, the 1986 law. And within this law, there was a full-on criminalization of both drug use and possession. The reference was to people who use drugs as drug addicts, and the sanctions incurred forced internment in psychiatric wards, fines, and prison sentence from 30 days to up to 1 year. Funnily enough, this same law, also from 1986, provided that you could have up to 20 plants of cannabis as home grown. So we had a very interesting kind of relationship with the law, because it allowed for home grow in a very broad way, but it also introduced very severe sanctions. And when the real turning point came was in 1994 through a constitutional court ruling. And here I want to invite the people who are listening who are Spanish speakers to check out a podcast that we have on the stories behind this ruling in 1994. It's called Libertad de Uso Personal. And we launched it last year with occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Constitution. It was a very specific moment in Colombian history, because while we had a new constitution that it was one of the most progressive constitutions in the world and introduced a new Bill of Rights, including the right to freedom, the right to autonomy, to personal and bodily autonomy, we were also in the midst of the heaviest confrontation between the drug cartels and the Colombian state. It was this moment when the feeling of the country was that the state was being seized by the cartels. It was the hunting down of Pablo Escobar in 1993. It was all of this moment that was going on. But at the same time, we were experimenting with this new constitution, and an interested citizen, just a random person, presented a law, a demand to the Constitutional Court, specifically on the articles that criminalize drug use, asking the court to tear them down because of their unconstitutionality, because the right to use drugs is part of the right to bodily autonomy and the free development of personality. And so this person, Alexander, a very complicated last name, you'll hear it in the podcast, brought this to the Constitutional Court. And again, the Constitutional Court was a newly formed body. Before the 1991 Constitution, we didn't have this institution. And in that particular moment at the Constitutional Court, there were some really progressive jurists. And so it came that we had ruling C-2221, and it created this figure of the personal dose. It declared that the norms that criminalize drug use are unconstitutional. And for those Spanish speakers, I do invite you to read the sentence. It's quite interesting. And just a quote from the ruling. It says that to consider the person as autonomous has its inevitable and inexorable consequences. And the first and most important of all is that matters that concern only the person must be decided by the person alone. To decide for them is to brutally snatch away their ethical condition and to reduce them to the condition of an object. So this was quite historic. In 1994, a legal body in Colombia, again, at the midst of this confrontation between drug cartels. And we had some years where this was all there was. So all sanctions were eliminated. There was just sort of a vacuum. And I think this vacuum got kind of concerning, because there was just a very comfortable space in saying, okay, so you're free to do whatever you want with your body, and then don't come asking for anything from the state. Don't come asking for care. Don't come asking for anything. You say you want to be free, so be free and don't bother anyone else. And I think this is how Colombian society and the very prohibitionist side try to engage with this constitutional decision. But then there was also a lot of concern about, the kids and the parks and the regular concerns that come from certain sectors of society. And when we had the very conservative governments of Álvaro Uribe, there was a constitutional reform that introduced prohibition in the Constitution. So, but it introduced it under the right to health. And this will continue to be the polarity where we stand with decriminalization in Colombia. So we still have standing the ruling from 1994 under the freedom of personality and the free development of personality, but we have a prohibition that states that to carry or use psychoactive substances is under prohibition except if with medical prescription. And under this constitutional reform, most of the even progressive developments that have gone on in subsequent reforms are by using the figure of the people who use drugs as a sick person. If there is any resistance to backlash against the personal dose, it can only be sustained, at least in courts, through this leap of declaring that the person is ill. Then we had the really regressive reform in 2016, which was the National Police Code. And this law introduced 16 articles that have some sort of sanctions for drug use and possession, mostly in public spaces, especially in public spaces that are close to schools, universities, religious centers, so on and so forth. So this is where we stand today with the Decrim model in Colombia. We have this polarity between freedom and pathologization of drug use. And this has also moved forward in other rulings from the Supreme Court. For example, there is in addition to the figure of the personal dose, we have an additional figure created by the Supreme Court called the supply dose, which has been developed through cases that have reached the Supreme Court of people who had in their possession an amount that was slightly higher than the personal dose. So the personal dose is 1 gram of cocaine and 20 grams of cannabis. And in criminal proceedings where people have been caught with an amount higher than that, they've been automatically prosecuted as traffickers. So the doctrine that the Supreme Court has developed is that it is the duty of the prosecutor and not of the defendant to prove that they had the intent to distribute. But this figure then has been developed through saying, well, this person needed to possess more than the allowed amount of the personal dose because he's so sick, or she's so sick, or he's so ill that he needs to carry more than the amount. And this has been the window by which more progressive, but then you really ask yourself, is this really progressive just to have to pathologize everything? And then the other development, and not related to the right to health, has been just people trying to defend the spirit of the 1994 decision through trying to bring down some of the norms of the police code. There have been 2 big cases that have reached the Constitutional Court, cases that have tried to strict down the general prohibition to use in public spaces, because how is it that you have the right to a personal dose and the right to use, but if you don't have a house, where you can comfortably use, then you will be sanctioned. So who does the Decrim work for in Colombia? The Decrim works for maybe those who can have their substances delivered to their home, who have the ability and the possibility to use in their own homes, and who don't need to use public spaces. So these norms in the police code, in the first ruling in 2009, they were struck down. The Constitutional Court stated that there cannot be a general prohibition to use in public spaces because it goes against the 1994 ruling. But then there was one that just came out this year, and it stated the same thing again, but it gave the power of authority to local administrations to decide and regulate use in public spaces. And we see it like a very dangerous move where it will be up to anyone's game, and what are the local demands, and how can this be used politically for, of course, political gains. Just to finalize, as I'm coming to the end of my time, of course, as I've stated, so the main issue here is that we're between this polarity of the right to freedom and the right to health, and I think as civil society and as activists, it's been really complex to try to navigate how to protect the ruling of 1994 without falling into this excessive pathologization of drug use. And also, I think it has made it, the decree model has in some ways made us comfortable in not really trying to document what is happening in the everyday space of people who have to use drugs in the streets. So the data is very dispersed. We do have some data, and I just pulled it up for this event. So for example, just this semester, the police imposed 120,000 fines. So just in 6 months. So if this law has been going on for 2016, how many fines have been imposed by the police? There are procedures by which you can appeal these fines. And so I think we need to do a bit more effort and turn our eyes back to what are the nuances of our decree model, who is being able to benefit from this decree model, as I stated before, and who really is not benefiting from the decree model, because as long as there is criminalization for using in public space, this will of course mean that the people we know will be criminalized, will of course be criminalized. That'll be all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That's such a rich presentation, touching upon really crucial issues in relation to decriminalization, like pathologization, like the question of bodily autonomy, the question of public use and who is harmed when public use is criminalized. And also something that I find really interesting, and this in some way represents a regional trend, how apex courts, so constitutional courts, Supreme Courts all over Latin America have developed a very rich jurisprudence on drug use and bodily autonomy, or like the free development of the self or self personality, and it's really interesting to see then I was going to say dialogue, but a conflict between interpretations brought by apex courts and then interpretations that are made usually in a politically motivated fashion by political agents, parties, and people who are invested in maintaining coercion and involuntary approaches to to people who use drugs, and their needs. And that takes me then to one model that has been, or a country where there has been such an intense backlash precisely around the issue of coercion, which is the Oregon decriminalization effort, which now faces so much, in my opinion, undue criticism. But maybe this is the moment to ask Theshia, how does decrim look like in the US at the moment, and in particular, Oregon?
Great, thank you so much, Juan. Can you hear me okay?
Theshia,
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Juan and André and colleagues at IDPC and Release for putting on this very timely event. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about the US experience. So just starting, the decrim landscape in the United States has multiple layers. And so most of my remarks will focus on Oregon, since I know that's like a hot topic in the news currently. But I just want to give a little bit of context, with single substance decriminalization, for example, cannabis in the United States. There've been, various efforts at decriminalizing cannabis starting in the 1970s. In fact, Oregon was one of the first states to decriminalize cannabis, and issued a citation for possession of cannabis at a certain weight cutoff. And today in the United States, decades later, we have 23 states plus the District of Columbia that have enacted laws permitting cannabis for adult use. So it's like a full-scale legalization model. Many of these have included decrim provisions. And the reforms were driven, some of the decrim reforms were driven by an acknowledgement of previous injustices and racial disparities resulting from prohibition. So the decades of cannabis decrim and now legalization, there have been some reparative measures, as in expungements for prior criminal histories or prior cannabis arrests and convictions. And, it certainly is a good model in terms of some of the reparative nature in recent cannabis legalization and decrim models in the United States. There's a lot written on that. I'm not going to focus a lot on that. What I want to just flag is that we've seen a growing interest in decriminalizing specific substances. So cannabis initially, now we've seen, a trend to decriminalize plant-based psychedelics, with the state of Oregon and Colorado also taking a step to decriminalize psychedelics and allow it for therapeutic use. So decrim under limited circumstances. So these are certainly steps, like important steps in the right direction. However, as Juan indicated in the beginning, in order to really achieve systemic change in drug policy, we need much more than single substance reforms. Because decades of experience from the war on drugs has provided ample experience of the harms and failures of criminalization. And we've seen, certainly in the US, but from examples around the world, how the punitive approach has imposed substantial barriers to employment, housing, public benefits, educational opportunities, and really has torn families apart. And so this takes me now nicely to what's happened in Oregon. So in 2020, the state of Oregon voted, so it was through a ballot initiative, passed a decriminalization law, which essentially removed criminal penalties for possession of drugs for personal use. There were specific weight cutoffs based on the substance, and then also called for a significant expansion of funding to increase access to services. And so I'm not going to go into the details of the law. There are some materials hopefully we can share in the chat where you can click on the timeline for implementation and exactly the details of the Oregon decrim model. But what I will say is that, the measure passed in 2020. In 2021 is when the decriminalization provisions took effect. And then there was several months later that the initiative was implemented in the sense of funding decisions being made and money being dispersed to organizations and government entities to try and provide the services. So implementation is still in the early stages, but there are some, significant improvements that we have seen from various fronts. First and foremost, there's been a tremendous reduction in arrests. The reform has kept thousands of people outside of the criminal legal system. And data show that the average number of arrests for drug possession after it was implemented fell by 65%. So that's a huge drop in drug possession arrests. There was a huge expansion of funding for needed services. In fact, more than $300 million have been provided to a variety of programs. And it's not a one size fits all. People all understand that drug use and perhaps substance use disorder might be a chronic relapsing condition. There's no one size fits all. And so the funding provides services for overdose prevention, harm reduction, housing, peer support, addiction recovery programs. And Isabel just talked about housing and how the unhoused are typically the ones targeted by enforcement. And Oregon clearly acknowledges the need for, to support people with housing. The other thing that the Oregon funding and the way the model was designed during the implementation process is that it went to fund services that are not typically covered by other publicly funded insurance programs. So usually harm reduction, recovery support, housing might not be covered through typical insurance or public insurance. And so the funding in Oregon was really designed to ensure that low-income individuals have access to a variety of low barrier services. And tellingly, the data from the Oregon Health Authority, who is one of the key implementing bodies, shows increases in the number of people seeking treatment, employment, and housing services. And so there's data out there that shows just in terms of the numbers of people accessing these services. So despite these significant steps forward, there have been concerted efforts by the opponents of decriminalization who wish to repeal the measure and return to a punitive approach. These attacks allege that the measure has led to increases in drug use, and they've promoted the false narrative that reduced arrests have resulted in public disorder and an increase in the numbers of unhoused people. The reality is that the overdose crisis in the United States broadly is the result of a toxic drug supply, and overdose rates have increased at alarming rates across the United States. And changes in Oregon's overdose rates really track with national trends, and are very comparable to states that retain criminal penalties for drug use. So that means the remaining 49 states all have the same, varying levels of overdose increases over the past several years. And it's not isolated to Oregon, which is a decrim state. And in fact, just this week, a couple of days ago, a recent study was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry publication that essentially dispels the myth that decrim has led to an increase in overdose numbers in Oregon. The other thing regarding the crisis of houselessness or homelessness, even before Measure 110, which is the decrim measure passed in Oregon, the state, and especially the major metropolitan areas, have had a huge shortage of affordable housing. If you go to many major cities in the United States, and I imagine throughout many regions in the world, housing is in short supply, certainly affordable housing. And so issues of an increased visibility of unhoused folks has been a trend that we've been seeing. I live in the state of California. We have criminal penalties for drug possession. We're also seeing a huge population of unhoused folks disconnected from any kind of penalties for drug possession. So I'll just, I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to say that, there was the pandemic, and it also exacerbated the crisis for unhoused folks, and it has impacted communities around the nation. Unfortunately, the opposition has blamed the decrim measure for many social problems, and have said the lack of arrest has led to public disorder, and the media, unfortunately, has perpetuated these false narratives. The data shows something different, and so for us, we're going to stay the course. We're going to continue to fight to preserve decrim. I think ushering in a health approach through Oregon's Measure 110 was the right move in 2020, and continues to be the right move. And we cannot backslide into failed drug war policies. So happy for the conversation later, and thanks again for this opportunity.
That was fantastic, Theshia, and it made me think of so many things, including recently in a webinar about decriminalization. A colleague, David Menschel, talked about these attacks on decriminalization in Oregon being vibes-based, because the research that we have shows the opposite to what the opposition is suggesting. Actually, concerted effort, concerted action from governments in order to reduce the conditions of vulnerability that people are exposed to and that lead to harm and to premature death actually saves lives and improves lives. And we have the research to suggest it. I am also reminded of a study that was referenced by the European Drugs Agency, which shows that there is no correlation between decriminalization and use prevalence. So Yeah, fantastic. I know that there will be many questions around this in a second, but before we go into the round of questions, I want to go to another model that not only has been sort of in many ways revered for better and for worse in drug policy reform circles, but also resulted from a concerted governmental effort to change the paradigm. And this already in 1999. So like we're talking about a model that is about to be in Portugal turning almost a quarter of a century. And before I pass the floor to Joana, I'm reminded, and it's something that stayed with me at the Harm Reduction Conference in 2018 in Porto. Former president of Portugal, Sampaio, when this reform took place, talking about the reform, and I will quote it because I find the quote really powerful. Successes are not timeless. What was innovative in the past and produced change for the better has to be kept under permanent scrutiny, evaluation, and review. We cannot sit on our laurels, and maybe Joana can talk a little bit to what extent has Portugal rested on its laurels, and what can be done to improve it.
So, hello everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, the Portuguese model, the bestseller in drug policy, has so much to tell. Good things, of course, in terms of public health and achievements, and some rights regarding people use drugs, but not totally. When we look at the emancipation of people use drugs regarding this model, from pathologization, or even when we look at the stigma that is still so much into the structures, either treatment or even sometimes accessing to harm reduction. So, and not talking about prisons, because I think looking back, one of the things that happened for these more than 20 years is that for sure in 1999, with a strategy called the National Strategy Against Drugs, were implemented like a common willing, like in a social consultation, to achieve the decriminalization law that introduces the commissions of dissuasion of addiction. So a law focused on dissuasion that kind of removes the justice power on people who use drugs and move it to the health system somehow. So since then, when you are caught up by police with drugs in public space, for instance, you might be redirected or referral to a commission of dissuasion of addiction. And if it's your first time and you don't show up, probably you pay a fine of 25 euros. But it may happen that you have more than the 10 days allowed by the law. That means like 25 grams for cannabis, or 2 grams for cocaine, 1 gram of heroin. Very random 10 days allowance that comes from 1993 decree law. But now we have a new, I think I've gave many talks on the criminalization, and I never had news. And these times I do have, because just in September, it was published a new law doing some amendments to the law from 1993 and also to the decriminalization law from 2000. So what happens now is that even if I'm caught with more than the amount allowed, I'm going to court, that's for sure, but I'm not sanctioned in first sight. I have the possibility to defend that I'm a person who uses drugs and needs to have more than the quantities allowed. So far, this was not possible. So for instance, for me, if I have 5 grams of cannabis and I'm going on a festival and I'm taking for sure cocaine or ketamine with me, I would have a sanction that could start in 300 euros because it was a crime. So in 2019, more than 1,000 people were sanctioned as criminals because of a jurisprudence of 2008 by the Supreme Court that state if we have like cumulative substances, so we are criminals already. This and the new psychoactive substances raising in the markets, together with a lot of toxic supply around this, made these new changes. It's just entering force 2 days ago. So from the 1st of October, if I'm caught up with any new psychoactive substance or any other drug in terms of cumulative, but I can defend myself as a user, it seems that I'm not going to be sanctioned anymore. We are looking for it because this is very recent, so 2 days in force, and we have this problem that before the police force cut up the new changes to the law and get informed about the new psychoactive substances in the market, maybe it takes some time, and we keep on going either to the commissions of dissuasion of addictions or to court, and we being sanctioned. But at least this law means to protect more the right of people who use drugs, because so far the numbers were very a scandal, no? In a country that the crime for using drugs is supposed not exist. In 2019, having more than 1,000 people criminalized is much. We are only 10 million, so but it's something, and it's much. So this was the news I wanted to give you. First of all, these changes in the law that I think they are not still in the map because they are very recent. But looking back, of course, we had a lot of public health gains, namely, I think we all know that the decriminalization was introduced because of the high HIV rates, and now all the public health is pretty much along this decriminalization policy and has shown public gains in terms of individual health and community health. But in terms of participation, we still have a lot to demand. So for these recent years, for more than 10 years, and I can then drop some articles for you to read here, there are no change in the strategy for the application of the drug law, even regards in access to treatment, harm reduction, reinsertion. So, for instance, when we look at the situation of women using drugs, we still have a lot of social control around, and the loss of custody of children just for using drugs, it's a big thing over here. Also, if we demand to participate in the new strategy or action plan as a part of the community, we don't have a forum for drugs. So there is no political dialogues like structural ones. There are many informal dialogues where actually we are invited to give our opinion. But it takes a lot of time. For instance, naloxone was only available for community distribution since the pandemics. And that's something that we know, and we have loads of data proving that it saves life in the community, not only near the emergency teams. So we move, very slowly. Even the first drug consumption room was open in 2019. It was a mobile project. For sure, with a lot of community participation, clients could even be employed in a low threshold program. This is also very innovative at a certain point. But then we have 2 more drug consumption rooms, one in Lisbon and the other one fixed in Porto that has 1 year. And they are for sure not enough, and we don't have like a national strategy to address drug problems. So if you are a drug user and you live in a rural countries, in the countryside of the country, we don't have the same accessibility, for instance, to harm reduction services. And decriminalization doesn't work in these spaces because the police forces, including the military police, go after drugs more than ever, and nowadays, since the pandemics, even more. I guess this is one of the reasons also these amendments to decriminalization were recently made. Also, I want to communicate some hesitations to regulate, for instance, cannabis. We had last week a conference in the parliament about use of cannabis in youngsters. A lot of, even the political parties were present, but a lot of experts delivering their presentations. And it's still not clear how to move forward. I think now, since Germany regulate, we have much more pressure within our socialist party, which has the majority in government to move forward this policy. But a lot of pushback, a lot of demagogical speeches around drug use still, even in a country where it's supposed to have more information in terms of prevention and reduction treatment. This is not still happening so much. I was recently in a medical conference and I had the opportunity to hear that new treatments like ketamine are being used for mental health issues such as depression in public hospitals. And this is also a new good thing. Again, in Lisbon and not in the rest of the country, but we need to start somewhere. And yeah, I will see what this means, that I can have more drugs with me for more than the 10 days of allowance. But in practice, we need to evaluate drug policy with much more, I mean, from not in each 20 years, we need them to reformulate drug policies and this maintenance of the law. It's very important to check at least, or do a checklist of people use drugs human rights, because I was listening to Isabel talking about the autonomy, and this is so far-fetched over here. Even you are experts using drugs, having all the expertise in the terms of the policy field or the research field, and they still look at you like, oh no, again, like, you use drugs. So it's like a very strange movement. And yeah, I think one of the things that we have as community we have won is like to fight back, to go and have these informal moments of discussion that you can push for policy change. And at a certain point, it leads us to be more present and effective. But yeah, to finalize, I just want to reclaim also, or to denounce that, for instance, peer-led responses don't have any funding from state, okay? And I guess the community is, there is a lack, not only to use community as a totem, like come here and speak and show that you have a voice, but also to promote specific fundings for community-led responses. Access to fundings to NGOs that also promote a lot of professionalization of peer works. It means including people use drugs in the service delivery, and access to innovation in treatment, because I guess here, as anywhere else in the world, we also have been looking at the patterns of drug use, and they have been changing a lot. And for instance, the treatments are not updated. It's very much focused in heroin, like in the 90s and in 2000 when the decriminalization appeared. So every treatment or access to public health is under the umbrella of heroin or HIV. But now we have much more challenges, namely regarding crack cocaine use. And we need to update our treatments in guidelines that guarantee the access to humanity and to decent drugs, legal and illegal ones. And also to fight back more the war on drugs, to change a bit the speech and not being only in the part of the user, but thinking about the supply side. I guess this is the effects from the Western countries, I would say, the Northern Hemisphere. So yes, if you have any question, then I'm happy to answer.
That was fantastic, Joana. A good reminder that decriminalization does create some breathing space for systems of care to flourish, but those systems of care need funds, resources, and of course, community leadership, as you were saying. And I think that's something that usually gets cast aside. And when I was talking about sort of intentional government policies towards decriminalization, of course, when we talk about Portugal, we're talking about a system that was created already 23 years ago. And I hope to see a new impetus for decriminalization that for the first time actually centers people who use drugs instead of sort of treating them like an afterthought, or as you say, engaging them tokenistically. And this question of community leadership is one that I'm sure we'll hear from Angela McBride, who's about to also present to us how communities organize in order to achieve decriminalization, and this in probably the first country in the African continent to move towards decriminalization from legal avenues. So you have way more knowledge than me. So Angela, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone, all the panelists. It's really inspirational to hear and see how similar our movement is and how much we all want the same thing. Just from our side, especially South Africa, we want to share some of our experiences, some of the work that we've done, and kind of just, highlight how we can work together to make a change. So in last year, we did a Our Rights, Everybody's Rights policy scan. This was supported by InPUD and also took place in Nigeria and Indonesia, as well as South Africa. In SA, personal consumption is criminalized, and as a result, and I think I'm preaching to the choir in that sense, we all know that criminalization leads to risky drug use methods, unregulated and erratic drugs, the targeting of the vulnerable communities, amongst other harms. And especially during COVID-19 and the lockdown in South Africa, we noticed that we saw that there was in South Africa, there was an alcohol and cigarette ban during COVID-19. And for an extended period of time, alcohol was not available, cigarettes were not available. And we know from experience that that doesn't stop people. It doesn't stop people from smoking. It doesn't stop people from drinking. If anything, we just found more harmful, unregulated alternatives. For example, people were making pineapple beer in their homes, which led to poisoning, as well as in some cases explosions, the combustion and all of the yeast and whichever. But that was probably the least of the harms. I mean, in a longer term, I don't know whether it would be a study or whichever, we could be able to see what would happen, seeing as there were so many different types and unregulated cigarettes that were coming into the country and that were being distributed and sold at exorbitant prices. And we've noticed that, criminalization has, sorry, my cat, criminalization has led to a great deal of harm. And this also includes, unfair and justifiable testing, drug testing at workplaces, which can result in people losing their jobs. People who use drugs who are homeless and unemployed, but are known to be people who use drugs, are targeted by law enforcement. And that vicious cycle of arrest, thrown into jail, exposed to additional trauma, and ruining an entire person's life as a result, has really proven, that it's really proven that criminalization does not work. And in fact, that we need to decriminalize in order to make a change. And the need for decrim has been ever present in South Africa for a number of years. So just a little bit more explanation around the Our Rights, Everybody's Rights policy scan. Through this workshop, we had multiple people from across South Africa, whether it was key role players or people from the community coming together. An advocacy roadmap was drafted over for a period of 5 years, and how can we move towards advocating for decrim along with a number of other topics and key advocacy issues. But one of the key points that came out of this advocacy roadmap was the need for an increased understanding of decriminalization by communities and people in South Africa, but within a South African context. And with that said, we worked as a post-activity to this Our Rights, Everybody's Rights drug policy scan. We were able to host a virtual mixed learning decriminalization course, and we were really lucky. We leaned on the decrim course that was designed by Mainline and IDPC. The link is at the bottom of this slide, and I'll also pop it in the chat now. And pretty much what happened was people were encouraged to do one module of this decrim course, and then there was a virtual 2-hour session with a facilitator. In our case, it was Andrew Schreiber, as well as class and a number of Sanford team members that shared and gave input and provided a platform for 2 hours to dissect these modules, but also put it into a South African context. And what was especially amazing, if I'm understating, was leaning on and collaborating with people and organizations that have been leading the advocacy for decrim, and not just with drug use, but also with sex work and the cannabis decrim movement as well. So I think what made this such a special, or at least it's been a very special past few years, is, you know, seeing and collaborating with like-minded organizations, activists, and sharing our knowledge with each other. You know, we had Fields of Green who came and shared, Myrtle from Fields of Green who came and shared their experience when it came to the decriminalization of cannabis. But we also had people from Sisonke, the sex work movement here in South Africa, who came and shared their experience and how they are working towards decriminalization of sex work. So altogether, it really did make a huge difference looking at the collaborations, looking at working together, and especially, like we say, leaning on partners and activists in our country. Because when it comes to private spaces, it comes to personal use, drugs are very much looked down on and frowned upon. And even with the decriminalization of cannabis, there's still so much stigma that surrounds it. And it also has a very negative influence on people who live in local communities and indigenous communities, and who have been growing marijuana and cannabis for an extended amount, many generations. And now with this new approach to cannabis, these people are being pushed aside. Their crops are going to waste, they're being left behind. And this is again such a huge gap. And even though we're still all fighting for decrim across the board with substances, we've noticed that even within these spaces and on these platforms, when it comes to certain drugs, that there's still issues. There's still issues that need to be spoken about and pushed back on. Yeah, and this is also just Photosees courtesy of Fields of Green, and just out of respect for Jules, who passed away a few years ago. Both Jules and Myrtle played a huge role in decrim of cannabis here in South Africa. Both the drug policy scan at the in 2019, sorry, where are we? 2023, so 2022. Both the drug policy scan as well as the online decrim course led to this global trainer of trainers for the Our Rights, Everybody's Rights training, which took place in Cape Town, South Africa, earlier this year. And we were really lucky to have amazing, you know, absolutely inspirational activists coming together in one space, all speaking the same language and finding ways of, you know, copying and pasting what's working well in each country, and bringing it together. I mean, we had people from Kenya, we had people from Nigeria, we had people from Latin America, all over the world. And it was really, really special to have this platform in this space. And this is my in closing slide, but there's another closing slide that I'll need some assistance with. But just kind of rounding off some of the things that, you know, I wanted to mention particularly is that looking at the online decrim course that we did, it was such a pure example of we don't need to be recreating anything. If anything, we need to be making and putting these resources into country specific or country context. So we, for example, like we said, we had this and we used this mainline IDPC course, but then by having these 2-hour sessions, we were able to unpack it within the South African context. And I think that's really, really important, is to say that, yes, we have these resources from all over the world, but we can't forget who we're serving and where we're serving. And that kind of leads to my next point of that decrim is supposed to be personal. It needs to be personal, because coming from me, coming from whoever else it is, I know the impact that criminalization has on me and the people I love and care about. And by taking on that ownership and addressing stigmatizing and discriminatory behaviors and actions is the only way that we can gradually start change. yeah, to work together. Collaborations equal voices, and the more voices we have, the more likely we have an opportunity for change. And nothing about us without us. And I'm going to now say thank you, but also ask, as I stop my screen, ask if someone could please share the other. Yes.
African Police Week, halala. Halala, African Drug Policy Week, halala.
African Policy Week has evolved out of the South African Drug Policy Week in previous years. We're very fortunate that we've got representation from the Africa Union here. We've got people from several African countries, and some of them are policymakers. We've got active engagements with members of parliament from Kenya and Tanzania, and obviously the Eastern Southern African Drug Policy Commission is also involved. We heard South Africa's former president speak today. So this is really just a catalyst for the conversations, and we're going to approach it the same way as we did in South Africa, through relationship building.
It's very, very important that stakeholders come together during this Africa Policy Week.
You know, we need something this in other regions. Like, this is a very good initiative.
Drug Policy Week, Africa Policy Week, is a great initiative to bring together a variety of actors around this particular theme of what are the solutions. The current approaches aren't working. What can be done to improve the situation?
The war on drugs, which is actually a war on people, is battering whole communities and keeping them marginalized.
Stop stigma and discrimination and strengthen prevention.
There's no way that you can come up with effective regulations if we are still criminalized.
When time comes, we hope that things will change and people will start putting people first.
Africa needs to take care of its people. We are not going to wait for foreign aid anymore. It's time that we took care of our own.
Young people are not problems to be solved, but are problem solvers. And I believe it's about empowering those, those are our future generations. That's where it starts.
We're not living with a drug problem, we're living with a societal problem. Clearly, prohibition-focused drug policy remains one of the fundamental barriers we must remove before achieving an open, just and equitable society in South Africa, Africa, and internationally. We are, after all, just people, fallibly human, but humanly lovable. We need compassion. And that's what I want to say to you all. When in doubt, when you are fighting a fight, stop fighting. Sit down and listen, talk, and understand we are all human. And all of us are just looking to live a life that's a little bit better. Make the difference in somebody's life, please. Thank you very much.
We are ready for 2030. We are ready. We are ready to change policies and say, on your marks, get set. We are ready to change policies and say, on your marks, stand up, get set. You are not ready.
This was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Angela. I was thinking in watching the video the other day, thinking through, and this will sound really funny, but like, what is revolution? What is what would it look like to make revolution today, to change dramatically the world we live in? And this person was defining it as like a radical change in the way we relate to each other and institutions relate to us. And it's really beautiful to see communities organizing in South Africa precisely to do that. and to build from the grassroots up. And I hope that that will avoid some of the perils and shortcomings that other models that have been implemented from the top down have shown to unfortunately struggle with that connection to the grassroots and that grounding reform in the material realities of the communities that experience these policies. So thank you so much for that, a video and a presentation that's so full of hope. I see many questions forward in the Q&A, and maybe this is a time to then address them. By the way, the chat will be enabled now, so if you want to have discussions there that speak to what these questions are addressing, please feel free to do it. So there is a question from an anonymous question about the Colombian situation. So Isabel maybe can give us a hand with this in terms of what is the new government's approach to the legal framework in Colombia nowadays? Are they proposing any changes to the decrim model or beyond? Maybe Isabel can give us a very quick overview of what's changing and what might not be changing.
Sure, thank you. I was just, as we're having this conversation, the new national drug policy is being launched right in this moment. So I was trying to text and figure out if anyone at the event has said anything on this. And actually the Ministry of Justice, so he said that that people who use drugs will no longer be prosecuted by the police. But it's funny because a version of the policy has already been leaked, and it doesn't include any introduction of reform to the police code. And unless there is a reform to the police code, then how can he promise that no more sanctions will be imposed for people who use drugs? So the answer is we're not clear on what they're proposing ahead. I think that in this course, they're saying the right things, but to really figure out which of it is just lip service and which of it will be meaningful change, especially as they don't have sufficient majorities in Congress to move forward with the policy changes that are needed, especially with the police code reform that is needed. I think that in the coming days, a newer version of the policy will probably be launched. The one that leaked was probably not the final version. So once we get that final version, I hope I have the same answer that this person posed, so I hope we'll get that answer.
I realized I was muted. I was just saying fingers crossed we'll find in that policy what we expect to see. There's another question about how to, after policy changes, how to ensure that that policy is implemented as expected. I'm looking at Theshia, I'm looking at Joana. Maybe you have thoughts on this. Please feel free, everyone else, to take the floor. How do we ensure compliance with what has been agreed politically?
Joana, do you want to go first, since I think you have more decades of experience on that front?
Yeah, here it was a very top-down initiative from the beginning. But I guess these informal moments, and for instance, having an arm reduction network, CASO, an association of people using drugs organized since 2009, a lot of peers engaging in service delivery, especially in arm reduction and treatment, gave us some meaningful ways, even slow ways, but meaningful at a certain point, to intervene and evaluate ourselves what is going bad and wrong in a certain way. But I guess he's missing structural ways of doing that. So no evaluation was made to the policy for 20 years. And no external, no internal evaluation. Also, there is no forum for drugs, as I said, so civil society has no official place for debating the police. Not initiatives like this one we've seen from South Africa are done over here. So sometimes, like it happened in 2019, NGOs working in the field and being very an arm reduction academy from the very beginning, push for a policy change, recalling on a high level agencies and experts from in drug policy field to come to Portugal and debate these questions. And of course, it always goes, it can go a way and another, because we all know this depends on in the last case scenario from the decision makers to make innovative ways of pushing for drug policy forward or not. So I was remember like a specific occasion, I even cried. It was important, Harm Reduction International Conference, and the mayor were saying, we are opening a drug consumption room now, we'll be doing this. And 3 years later, the same mayor was saying, okay, we are going to criminalize drug users because they are in our backyards, and our neighbors need to be safe, and we need to expel people from their tents, which is the only place they have to live, with no alternative solutions like proper housing or housing first programs available. So I guess, yeah, Ligia is sending a video on the decriminalization from drug users' lens. We have a lot of support, for instance, from InPUD and EuroNPUD, the International Network of People Use Drugs and the European Network of People Use Drugs, to speak up, because otherwise we'll be very silent over here.
Thank you so much.
And of course, we act together. So we do a lot of demonstrations, and we enjoy from the Support Don't Punish Global Day of Action to make our noise and to organize the community around drug users' rights and policy reform. And we do a lot of open letters, and we knock the municipalities, we knock the government. But yes, it's only about that.
That is a fantastic sort of snapshot into the importance of community organizing to ensure accountability. Theshia, some thoughts about compliance and ensuring compliance?
I mean, what I will say is, I mean, I really agree with what Joana was saying. I mean, I think, change takes time, and and so, I mean, it's kind of difficult. You can get at this through many different angles. I would say, in Oregon, it was a voter enacted reform. So there was widespread support to begin with. There was also a lot of, coalition building and like grassroots up level organizing for this reform. But 2 years later, we're hearing that there are actual repeal efforts, and people are trying to go to the very voters who've enacted this by a large margin to then repeal it. I mean, I feel like, in terms of ensuring compliance or like sticking with it, it's number one, highlighting change takes time, and it took 50 years plus of the war on drugs to get us to this. We're not going to unwind the punitive system overnight, give it time. I mean, I also think in Oregon, there was such a huge delay in the funding going out and for the services infrastructure to get up and running, that there's this appearance that people are not getting connected to services. So with time, as we see that happening, I think maybe attitudes will, or if not attitudes will change, I think the people who supported this initially maybe reinforce that this is the right thing. And then I think, ultimately leading with a health approach, leading with a public health approach, elevating the harms of criminalization and why it hasn't worked and it never will work, could resonate with folks, because I think widespread, when you do polling, people have agreed the war on drugs has been an epic failure. And so just reminding them, if you go back to criminalization, you're basically doubling down on a failed approach. And it doesn't mean that the solution is complicated, that we now have to revert to the failed approach. So, it's a wait and see to see what happens in Oregon, but currently there are efforts underway to repeal and undo the law.
That is, of course, unsettling, but I take from your response like the importance of doing awareness raising and political education in our communities, for our communities to understand the importance of decriminalization and the harms associated with criminalization that will always be there. And there's tons of research for it. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Theshia. The next question that we're going to respond. I see that we have 8 minutes, so just bear with us in case we're not able to respond to these questions. You can always write to us, but There's a question from Kylie about the power or not, and the power and the challenges of identifying as a peer in advocating for drug policy reform. And I'm in particular thinking of the European network of people who use drugs and the South African network of people who use drugs. Do you find that a challenge? Do you find that actually, on the contrary, a mode of empowerment? The floor is yours, Angie or Joana.
Maybe again the question, sorry, I got a bit lost.
Yeah, of course. I think the question from Kylie is about, to which extent do you find it necessary, powerful, or challenging to identify as a peer when you're doing your drug policy reform advocacy work?
I think for sure,
Yeah,
okay, the decriminalization helps a lot for, like, you know, at least from those of us that believe the identity, it's a way also to construct community. There is a way that you are not being criminalized for being who you are, but it takes certain risks. I guess it means you have to protect your community still, even here, because of these police codes, namely. I'm thinking now about manas and the fact that they assume themselves as women using drugs or even sex workers. It can happen that sometimes you state your identity, you even ask for help to your, you know, social services or demanding on the policy field, and it can be against you somehow. I was thinking about the loss of custody, and if you go and state, okay, I'm using drugs, but I need your help because I lost my employment, I'm not employed anymore, and it can be totally against you. So sometimes it plays in your favor because you can even get a job as a professional peer or as part of any community organization. But on the other side, sometimes it puts you still at risk. But I guess in the decriminalization model, if people are informed on their rights, and that's what we do a lot, to inform and to inform and to inform, we can prevent some situations like this and act as one. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Joana. I don't know if Angie's still with us, but maybe we'll go into the next question, which is about stigma and to which extent decriminalization, there's evidence to suggest that decriminalization contributes to destigmatization. The first thing that comes to mind is this amazing report. I don't know if we can put it in the chat, that Input produced precisely on the effects of decriminalization. And it is very interesting to see a report that is supplemented and structured around peer experiences in relation to decriminalization and how in some ways they found themselves being better treated by institutions, but then at the same time, almost all of them expressed that coercion and violence from the repressive apparatus of the state had also continued. So I don't know if anyone has any evidence that they could refer to about the impacts of decrim on stigma. Otherwise, I'll share the Input report with attendees. I'll share Input's report. This person, you're anonymous, but I'll be able to send all of these resources to all of attendees. There's another question in the Q&A for Isabel about the impacts of the US on criminalization in Colombia and to which extent US intervention and influence has had an impact on criminalization in Colombia. I think that might be a short answer.
Well, but it's actually interesting because now that I think about it, the role of the US with regards to criminalization of drug use is non-existent. They don't care about it because the problem with the US is what do we export to them? Not what happens with us internally, but what of our production gets to the US. So they've never really cared about what's the legal framework here, what happens with regulation, with decriminalization. They don't care about that at all. They care about the production phase. So they have indeed influenced to a degree criminalization of crop cultivation has to be maintained, and the restrictions around what can be done with so-called alternative development, and other forms of repression towards people who grow drugs or grow psychoactive plants. But with regards to decrim, they just don't meddle with that. It's not of their concern at all.
Thank you so much, Isabel. There's a question here from Lucky. I think their name is Thelma, actually, and they're in South Africa, and they're talking about how to fight discrimination and stigma against the police, like in the face of drug policing. I'm looking at maybe André, you might be interested in responding because there's been really interesting work, especially on policing and young people here in the UK.
Yeah, I think it becomes, I mean, it's such a large challenge, and I do think that decriminalization from the legislative side does help to create a legal structure that can provide that defense. But I mean, as we've seen with so many of the stories here, the discrimination part can only come after, you know, after a long public attitudes change support that can continue to exist even within systems that have decriminalized 2 decades ago, as we see with my home country of Portugal. So I think unless you are enshrining from the start in the discussions around decriminalization that changes to police operating procedures and practices aren't changed from the start, then you're already going to set up this decriminalization system for defeat. Whether that involves NGOs or working with police federations or police associations or even both from the start to have this kind of process would be, you know, it's kind of up to the national context, you know, and I see here in the UK and in some countries worldwide, you have the law enforcement action partnerships. You do have some law enforcement organizations that do work and are very vocal against prohibition. It could definitely be some partners to compare, because it's still, you know, from the criminalization side, it's still such a strong voice to have people that do enforce drug prohibition to be like, this is a system that doesn't work and we need to find an alternative. But again, also it depends on how much you want to work with police and forces that are controlling.
I'm also thinking of, in particular, like how do we organize to ensure that care and that resistance to police violence and police stigma? Of course, like finding sort of forward-thinking elements in that institution can take us places. But I'm thinking how, in particular in the UK, where we live in a context of criminalization, this is a country where decriminalization doesn't exist. Many communities or community-led networks, not only of people who use drugs, but also of young people, of racialized people, organize know your rights trainings, organize in order to intervene whenever police is using drug policing as a tool for harassing and brutalizing, in particular, racialized communities and in particular Black communities in the UK. So how do we advance policy reform to create that space for building systems of care, but also in the now, before legal reform, as Angie has said, but also as I have alluded to, how do we build community resilience and community resistance against this ongoing violence in the way towards legal reform? And there's so much that can be done in that direction, including campaigning. I'm very happy that I see the Support Unpunished campaign that I'm very honored to lead in the chat comments. This has been In Defense of Decriminalization. I hope you'll enjoyed it. I'm so grateful to all panelists for their fantastic interventions, and of course for attendees for the great questions. We could probably sit here for hours, but I'm sure we don't have it. So have a great afternoon, day, evening. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of the day.